Nike didn't just release a Caitlin Clark ad. They quietly made a decision. Not about marketing, not about basketball, and definitely not about a single season. Because if this were just a commercial, it would have done what every sports ad does. It would have hyped her first, celebrated her numbers, shown the logo threes, told you how special she is. Instead, Nike did something stranger. They doubted her. Casually, politely, almost playfully. And that choice changes how you're supposed to read everything that comes next. Most people watched that ad and thought it was about range. From anywhere. Deep shots. Confidence. Swagger. Another athlete proving people wrong. But that's not what Nike was selling. They were selling inevitability. They weren't asking if Caitlin Clark could make the shot. They were showing you what happens when the world keeps asking and keeps being wrong. And the scariest part? The ad wasn't aimed at fans. It was aimed at everyone who still controls the future of women's basketball. Because once you see what Nike actually revealed here, it becomes obvious why 2026 isn't just another year. It's the deadline. But to understand that, you have to look at the part almost everyone laughed off first. The doubt. At first, the doubt in the ad doesn't feel serious. That's the trick. It doesn't sound aggressive. It isn't loud. Nobody is yelling. Nobody looks angry. The skepticism arrives wrapped in humor, smiles, and casual disbelief. The kind of doubt that feels harmless enough to laugh at. She can't make it from there. No chance. I'm not even going to ask. That tone matters more than the words themselves. Because real doubt almost never shows up as hate. Hate is obvious. Hate gets attention. Hate is easy to dismiss. You can point at it, label it, and move on. Dismissal is different. Dismissal smiles at you. Dismissal pretends to be reasonable. Dismissal sounds like concern, logic, or experience. And that's the exact kind of doubt Caitlin Clark has faced her entire life. Not you're bad, but this won't translate. Not you can't play, but wait until the next level. That tone is dangerous because it feels smart. It feels informed. It sounds like it's protecting the game from chaos. Nike knew that. That's why the commercial doesn't hype Caitlin first. There's no dramatic build. No slow-motion confidence shots. No voice telling you how special she is. Instead, they let the doubt speak. And that decision flips the power dynamic completely. Because the moment Caitlin steps into the frame, something subtle happens. She doesn't argue. She doesn't explain. She doesn't ask permission. She doesn't even react. She just shoots. And when the ball drops, the message isn't that Caitlin proved them wrong. The message is that this wasn't a debate to begin with. Nike didn't frame the doubt as a villain to defeat. They framed it as background noise. Something that exists, speaks, and then fades the moment reality shows up. That's not an accident. That's brand psychology. Nike understands that greatness doesn't announce itself anymore. It doesn't need speeches. It doesn't need validation. It just needs repetition. Doubt appears. Action follows. Reality corrects the room. Once is impressive. Twice is interesting. After that, it becomes uncomfortable. Because repetition turns disbelief into embarrassment. And here's the detail almost nobody noticed. Those celebrities in the ad aren't random faces. They aren't there because Nike needed star power. They represent something much bigger than individual opinions. They represent institutions, media voices, analysts, gatekeepers, people who get paid to decide what's real and what's sustainable. Nike let them doubt first because that's how doubt always enters elite spaces. Politely, confidently, and with just enough authority to sound correct. But the commercial never gives them the final word. Caitlin doesn't take their doubt personally. She doesn't respond emotionally. She responds structurally. Shot. Result. Silence. That silence is louder than celebration. Because Nike isn't selling belief. They're selling inevitability. They're showing what happens when someone keeps showing up prepared while the world keeps underestimating them out of habit. The ad doesn't ask you to cheer. It asks you to recognize a pattern. And patterns are dangerous to doubt. Once people recognize that the same skepticism keeps showing up and keeps losing, the conversation shifts. Doubt stops sounding smart. It starts sounding lazy. And that's the real flex. Nike didn't protect Caitlin from doubt. They weaponized it. They turned it into a recurring character that never learns. And that framing only works because this isn't the first time Caitlin Clark has walked into a room where expectations were already capped. It's just the most visible. Because long before cameras, before arenas, before endorsement meetings, There was another place where limitations were quietly accepted by everyone except her. A driveway. Before the headlines, before the cameras, before anyone argued about whether her game would translate, Caitlin Clark was already solving a different problem. She wasn't asking how to fit in. She was asking why the limits existed at all. The driveway story usually gets told like a feel-good origin moment. A kid in Iowa. Cold winters. A cracked, slanted surface. The kind of setting people love to romanticize after success arrives. But that framing misses the most important detail. Caitlin didn't accept the driveway as a constraint. She challenged it. Most kids would have adjusted their shot, moved closer, changed angles, learned to live with the space they had. That's what adaptation looks like for almost everyone. Caitlin did the opposite. She looked at the problem and decided the environment was wrong. So she asked her dad to tear up the grass and pour more concrete. That decision sounds small when you say it fast. It isn't, because that's not athlete thinking. That's architect thinking. She wasn't trying to get better inside the space she was given. She was expanding the space itself. She wanted a full three-point line, not because it was impressive, but because it was honest. She wanted to practice the shots people would eventually tell her not to take. And that's the part that matters. Most players train to win today. Caitlin trained for the arguments she hadn't heard yet. That driveway wasn't just a place to shoot. It was a test environment. A controlled space where she could build comfort in shots that would later make defenders panic and critics complain. Every rep wasn't just physical. It was psychological. She was normalizing difficulty before the world ever called it reckless. And once you understand that, her entire career starts to make more sense. Because that mindset never disappeared. It scaled. When she moved up levels, the surfaces changed. Better gyms, cleaner lines, more structure, more rules about what was acceptable. But the instinct stayed the same. If the space felt too small, she didn't shrink her game. She stretched the court. That's why the driveway matters. Not because it was humble, not because it was lonely, but because it revealed something fundamental about how she processes limits. She doesn't negotiate with them. She redesigns around them. And that way of thinking is rare, even among elite athletes. Most great players are masters of adaptation. They tweak, refine, and optimize within boundaries. Caitlin treats boundaries like suggestions. That's why coaches, analysts, and scouts kept getting uncomfortable. Because when someone plays that way, it feels unstable. It feels like chaos waiting to be punished. People assume the game will eventually snap back into place. They assume the system will correct the outlier. What they didn't realize is that Caitlin wasn't trying to beat the system. She was quietly testing how flexible it really was. And every level she reached became another experiment. High school wasn't about dominance. It was about proof of concept. College wasn't about highlights. It was about pressure testing. The pros wouldn't be about survival. They would be about confirmation. That driveway wasn't the beginning of her range. It was the beginning of her refusal. A refusal to accept that someone else had already decided how far she was allowed to go. And once that refusal becomes habit, every new stage stops feeling intimidating. It starts feeling predictable. Because the moment you believe limitations are optional, you stop waiting for permission. You start daring the world to try and stop you. And that's exactly why, when Caitlin reached each new level, the same warnings kept showing up. Different voices. Same concern. Same confidence. They all believed the game would finally fix her. They didn't realize she'd been preparing for that moment since the driveway. By the time Caitlin Clark started climbing real ladders, the doubts stopped sounding casual. They sounded professional. High school coaches didn't say she wasn't talented. They said college defenses would expose her. College analysts didn't say she couldn't score. They said pros would force her into bad decisions. Pro voices didn't say she wouldn't belong. They said the league would finally humble her. Notice the pattern. Nobody attacked her ability. They attacked her sustainability. That's how correction works in elite sports. You don't tell someone they're bad. You tell them they're temporary. And every level delivered that message with absolute confidence. Her shot selection was unsustainable. Her range was inefficient. Her pace was too risky. On paper, it all made sense. Basketball history rewards conformity. The game has always favored what fits inside clean systems. Set spacing, predictable rotations, shots that coaches can live with. Caitlin violated all of it. She pulled defenders out of comfort zones they didn't even realize they depended on. She forced decisions earlier than defenses wanted to make them. She made coaches choose between bad options instead of good ones. And that's what really scared people. Because once defenders started stepping higher, the court stretched. Passing lanes opened. Help defense arrived late. Rotations broke. What looked reckless wasn't reckless at all. It was pressure. Sustained pressure. Night after night. This wasn't a shooter catching fire once a week. This was consistency that made scouting reports useless. You couldn't just say, "Don't let her shoot." You had to decide how far out "don't let her shoot" actually meant. And every extra step defenders took away from the basket created consequences elsewhere. That's when gravity entered the conversation. Not the highlight kind. The strategic kind. Caitlin Clark didn't just score points. She pulled entire defenses out of shape. Coaches stopped designing plans to stop her team. They designed plans to survive her presence. That's a massive psychological shift. Because now failure wasn't about giving up points. It was about giving up control. And control is what systems exist to protect. The more Caitlin played, the more obvious it became that the game wasn't correcting her. She was correcting the game. Analysts tried to reframe it. They called it confidence, then momentum, then a hot streak that lasted far too long to ignore. Eventually, the language softened. She's different. She changes spacing. She forces adjustments. Those are polite ways of admitting something uncomfortable. The old rules weren't working anymore. And when rules stop working, institutions get nervous. Because now the question isn't whether she can play. It's whether the system is flexible enough to contain her. At every level, people waited for regression. They waited for efficiency to drop, for fatigue to set in, for defenders to figure it out. Instead, her game matured. The shots didn't disappear. They became smarter. The chaos didn't fade. It became controlled. Caitlin wasn't improvising. She was dictating. And once that reality set in, the conversation quietly moved away from basketball entirely. Because when one player consistently forces strategic changes, ratings follow. Attention follows. Money follows. And that's when the focus shifted from stopping her to understanding what she was doing to the sport itself. Because this wasn't a breakout anymore. It was a leverage point. At first, the impact showed up quietly. A few broadcasts pulled higher numbers. Some arenas filled faster than expected. Merchandise moved a little quicker when she was on the schedule. Nothing alarming. Nothing headline-worthy. That's how disruption always starts. But then the pattern sharpened. When Caitlin Clark played, ratings jumped. When she didn't, they fell. Not emotionally. Not narratively. Mathematically. Viewers didn't just tune in, they stayed. They arrived earlier. They watched longer. They followed the story across games instead of dipping in for highlights. Cities noticed too. Ticket demand spiked when she came to town. Secondary markets reacted. Local coverage expanded. Sponsors adjusted activations around her presence. This wasn't fandom. This was behavior. And then the number landed that changed everything. Caitlin Clark generated roughly $36 million in economic impact, nearly 27% of the league's total, while missing time. That detail matters more than people realize. Because this wasn't a perfect, uninterrupted season. This wasn't inflated by non-stop exposure. This was influence under constraint, which made the signal even stronger. For the first time, the WNBA had something it had talked about for years, but never fully possessed. Proof. Not belief. Not optimism. Not long-term vision decks. Proof that one player could move the business. And once that proof exists, the balance shifts immediately. Because leagues are built on collective control. Schedules, marketing, narratives. Everything works best when no single person tilts the table too far. But Caitlin tilted it. Not loudly. Not intentionally. Just by existing on the court. And here's the part most fans never see. Once sponsors, networks, and partners recognize that one presence can move numbers, conversations change behind closed doors. Decisions stop being about the league as a whole. They start being about leverage. Who drives attention? Who holds viewers? Who changes outcomes when they're removed? Those questions don't stay hypothetical for long. And Nike saw the answers before anyone else said them out loud. This wasn't about popularity. Popularity spikes and fades. This was about structural influence. Caitlin Clark wasn't just attracting eyeballs. She was reshaping habits. And habits are the most valuable currency in sports. Because once fans build routines around a player, tuning in early, staying late, following road games. The ecosystem reorganizes around that behavior. That's when institutions lose narrative control. The league didn't announce this shift. They felt it. And once that feeling set in, the danger wasn't Caitlin dominating games. The danger was her making the league predictable around her presence. Predictability moves power, which explains the most confusing decision of all. Nike didn't rush. They didn't capitalize immediately. They didn't flood the market. They didn't squeeze the moment dry. They went quiet. Because when you understand leverage, you don't panic. You wait. In modern sports marketing, speed is everything. When momentum peaks, brands rush. They flood timelines. They lock in emotion before attention moves on. Nike did the opposite. They acknowledged Caitlin Clark's signature shoe, and then stopped talking. No teaser countdown. No aggressive leaks. No artificial urgency. Just a date. Spring 2026. To most people, that felt strange. Almost cautious. Like Nike was waiting to see if the hype would last. That interpretation couldn't be more wrong. Nike didn't delay because they were unsure. They delayed because they were certain. Because when a brand truly understands leverage, it doesn't chase the moment. It stretches it. Nike already had the data, the ratings behavior, the economic impact. The proof that Caitlin Clark wasn't just popular, she was foundational. So the question wasn't if she could sell a shoe. The question was how big the platform could become if they waited. By 2026, Caitlin wouldn't just be a headline. She'd be routine, a habit, a presence fans planned around. The difference between tuning in and tuning out. That's when platforms solidify. Nike CEO Elliott Hill said they're building this with Caitlin, not for her. That sentence explains everything. This isn't a logo slapped onto an existing template. It's a co-designed ecosystem. Story, design language, distribution, long-term purpose. Nike doesn't wait years unless they're building something meant to last decades. Most signature shoes chase relevance. This one is being positioned to define it. And notice what Nike didn't do. They didn't tie the launch to a single season. They didn't anchor it to a record or milestone. They didn't make it about personal legacy. They made it about timing, because timing controls perception. By slowing everything down, Nike let anticipation mature. They let conversations shift from "can she" to "what happens when it launches." That's a subtle but massive shift. One is doubt-based. The other is expectation-based. And expectations are far more powerful. Nike wasn't trying to win headlines. They were trying to lock position. By the time the shoe drops, Caitlin Clark won't feel new. She'll feel necessary. And that's the most valuable place a brand can occupy. Especially in a league still defining its long-term identity. Nike didn't want to ride the wave. They wanted to own the shoreline. And that patience signals something even bigger. They aren't planning for a spike. They're planning for permanence. Which only works if the athlete at the center isn't chasing attention. She's shaping it. And Caitlin Clark has made it clear from the beginning. This platform was never meant to end with her. Perfect. To scale this toward a 2-hour script, the key is depth through layers, not repetition. We do that by stretching Section 06 into a long institutional plus cultural arc that moves from one athlete movement systemic shift. Below is a super-duper extended Section 06, written to add massive length, gravity, and retention, while still flowing cleanly into Section 07 later. You can drop this directly in. At some point, the conversation around Caitlin Clark quietly stopped being about her stat lines. That moment didn't come with an announcement. It didn't trend. It didn't even feel dramatic. It just shifted. Because when a player starts affecting teammates, opponents, coaches, sponsors, and fan behavior at the same time, the focus naturally pulls outward. Caitlin stopped feeling like a star. She started feeling like infrastructure. And infrastructure changes how everything else moves. Look closely at how she operates now. The way she speaks. The way she redirects attention. The way she shares credit when she doesn't have to. Aaliyah Boston. Lexi Hull. Kelsey Mitchell. She doesn't absorb the spotlight, she diffuses it. That matters more than people realize. Most breakout stars centralize attention. They pull gravity inward. Everything revolves around them, and when they leave the floor, the energy collapses. Caitlin does the opposite. Her presence raises the baseline. Teammates play freer. Defenses hesitate longer. Coaches trust spacing that wouldn't exist otherwise. The floor feels bigger even when she isn't touching the ball. That's not dominance. That's amplification. And Nike noticed that early. Because brands don't just look for performance. They look for scalability. A player who needs to be the center of everything caps growth. A player who expands the environment creates room for others to rise with them. That's how movements form. Caitlin Clark doesn't talk about legacy the way most stars do. She doesn't frame success as something to protect. She frames it as something to distribute. Youth access, grassroots courts, early exposure. These aren't charity talking points. They're structural investments. Because if you actually want to change a sport, you don't start at the top. You widen the base. That's why international expansion keeps coming up in quiet conversations. Not as a marketing flex, but as a necessity. Because once a game becomes accessible earlier, farther, and cheaper, talent multiplies. Nike understands this better than anyone. They've done it before. Not by creating icons, but by creating pathways. And Caitlin fits that model perfectly because she isn't trying to protect a mystique. She's trying to normalize excellence. That's dangerous to gatekeepers. Because mystique keeps systems closed. Normalization opens them. And when something becomes normal, it spreads faster than hype ever could. That's why experts project this shoe as a potential 9-figure franchise. Not because of fashion, not because of resale culture, but because of usage. This isn't a shoe designed to sit on shelves. It's designed to live on courts. To be worn by kids who don't care about endorsements yet. Kids who just want something that works, something they've seen succeed, something tied to possibility instead of status. That's a different kind of influence. And it explains why Caitlin Clark doesn't move like someone protecting a throne. She moves like someone building roads. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable realization of all. She may be the last women's basketball star of her kind. Not because talent will disappear, but because the system she's helping build won't require singular saviors anymore. Once access expands, pipelines strengthen, and attention stabilizes, the sport stops relying on exceptions. It starts producing depth. Caitlin isn't trying to stand alone at the top. She's trying to make sure the climb behind her is shorter. And that's why Nike didn't frame her shoe as exclusivity. They framed it as opportunity. Because opportunity scales. And once opportunity scales, the sport changes permanently. Which is why the ad wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The work was already in motion. And all of it points toward the same moment. The same year. The same quiet line in the sand. There's a reason Nike understood what was happening before most people did. It isn't because brands are smarter than fans. It's because brands are forced to measure things fans feel. Emotion is invisible. Behavior isn't. Fans react. Brands track. They don't just watch highlights. They watch patterns. When people show up, how long they stay, what they buy after, what they stop buying when something disappears. Nike didn't fall in love with Caitlin Clark because of her jumper. They paid attention because of what moved when she entered the frame. Ratings stabilized. Merchandise shifted. Attention lingered. Those signals don't scream. They accumulate. And brands like Nike are built to recognize accumulation early. That's why they didn't wait for consensus. Consensus always arrives late. By the time everyone agrees something matters, the leverage is already gone. Fans often think change happens when people start talking loudly. It doesn't. It happens when behavior quietly refuses to go back to normal. Caitlin Clark didn't spike attention. She rerouted it. And once attention reroutes, brands don't ask for permission. They position. That's what this entire move is about. Nike wasn't responding to hype. They were responding to inevitability. And inevitability is the rarest asset in sports. Because hype fades. Narratives change. Stars come and go. But inevitability creates gravity. Once gravity exists, everything else has to orbit it. Which brings up an uncomfortable truth. Whenever something starts to feel inevitable, resistance appears. Not because it's wrong, but because it threatens existing balance. Every major shift in sports creates fear before it creates acceptance. Not fear of the athlete. Fear of what they represent. Caitlin Clark doesn't just challenge defenders. She challenges structure. She forces uncomfortable questions. If one player can drive this much attention, what does that say about how opportunity has been distributed before? If the audience responds this strongly, what does that reveal about what fans were waiting for? If brands move this decisively, who loses control? Gatekeeping doesn't always look like opposition. Sometimes it looks like caution. This is too much too fast. Let's slow down. Let's see if it lasts. Those phrases sound reasonable. They're also defensive. Because if Caitlin Clark succeeds at the scale Nike is preparing for, it resets expectations. About investment. About coverage. About who gets taken seriously early instead of late. Some systems rely on scarcity. Limited spots. Limited attention. Limited belief. Caitlin's rise breaks that model. She didn't wait for the sport to catch up. She pulled it forward. And that makes people uncomfortable. Not because she's doing something wrong, but because she's revealing how much room there always was. That's why criticism often sounds circular. She shoots too much. She changes the game too much. This isn't sustainable. Those aren't basketball critiques. They're stability critiques. They come from a desire to preserve a version of the sport people already understand. But sports don't stay still. They either expand, or they get bypassed. Nike understands which side of that line matters. For a long time, women's basketball operated under an unspoken agreement. Progress would be gradual. Growth would be careful. Change would be incremental. Caitlin Clark shattered that agreement without ever saying a word. She didn't demand attention. She attracted it. She didn't campaign for belief. She made disbelief expensive. And that's the real disruption. Because once attention proves it's willing to follow excellence consistently, patience stops being a virtue. It becomes a delay. Nike didn't want to be late to that realization. They didn't want to chase. They wanted to anchor. That's why this isn't framed as a moment. It's framed as a foundation. The shoe, the ecosystem, the timing, all of it signals permanence. And permanence changes how everyone else behaves. Other brands will follow. Other leagues will adjust. Other players will benefit. Not because Caitlin asked for it, but because she proved it was possible. And once possibility becomes proof, there's no going back. When Nike chose the phrase "from anywhere," they weren't talking to scouts. They were talking to everyone who's ever been told their starting point mattered more than their ceiling. Because in sports, geography has always been destiny. Certain cities get noticed earlier. Certain programs get more trust. Certain players get patience. Everyone else is expected to wait. Caitlin Clark didn't come from a basketball factory. She didn't arrive with institutional backing or inherited belief. She came from a place that rarely gets framed as the beginning of anything transformative. And Nike made that explicit without spelling it out. From anywhere isn't permission. It's defiance. It's a rejection of the idea that credibility only flows from certain zip codes, certain schools, certain systems. It reframes origin as irrelevant. Not inspirationally. Structurally. Because once fans internalize that excellence can come from anywhere, attention stops clustering around traditional power centers. It spreads. And spread is what changes ecosystems. That's why this message resonates far beyond basketball. It speaks to class, to access, to the quiet hierarchy that decides who gets seen early and who has to prove themselves longer. Nike didn't say this out loud because they didn't have to. They let Caitlin embody it. No speeches. No manifesto. Just evidence. And evidence travels faster than belief ever could. Most people see 2026 as the finish line. The shoe drops. The campaign launches. The moment peaks. That's backwards. Nike doesn't build toward endings. They build toward inflection points. 2026 isn't the payoff. It's the ignition. By then, Caitlin Clark won't be a curiosity. She'll be familiar. Embedded. Part of the rhythm of the sport. The kind of presence fans assume will be there. That's when real scaling begins. Youth players who grew up watching her won't just admire her. They'll model after her. Not just her shot, but her audacity. Her willingness to stretch the court, stretch expectations, stretch roles. And that's how change accelerates. Not when stars peak. When habits form underneath them. Nike knows that by the time the shoe hits the court, it won't just represent Caitlin Clark. It'll represent a generation that no longer waits for validation. That's why this timeline feels quiet. Because loud launches are for moments. Quiet launches are for movements. Here's the part almost nobody talks about. Nike isn't just preparing for Caitlin Clark. They're preparing for who comes next. Every time a sport expands, the first breakthrough star absorbs the pressure. They take the scrutiny. They endure the skepticism. They make space. Caitlin is doing that work right now. Which means the next wave won't arrive asking for permission. They'll arrive expecting opportunity. Players who shoot deeper without apology. Players who demand visibility earlier. Players who don't wait for systems to adapt. Nike is building infrastructure for that future. Shoes, programs, pathways. Because when talent pipelines widen, the brand that supported the expansion doesn't just gain loyalty. They gain legacy. That's the long game. And Caitlin Clark fits it perfectly because she doesn't cling to singular status. She doesn't act like someone guarding a throne. She acts like someone removing gates. There are moments in sports history where things could have gone back. This isn't one of them, because the proof exists now. The numbers exist. The behavior exists. The demand exists. Once fans demonstrate they'll follow excellence consistently, institutions lose the ability to slow it down without consequence. Nike understands that inertia favors those who move early. That's why this entire strategy feels calm. No scrambling. No overcorrection. No panic. Just alignment. Caitlin Clark didn't force this shift. She revealed it. And once revealed, it can't be unseen. When people look back on this era, they won't point to a single shot. They'll point to a quiet realization. That women's basketball didn't need permission to grow. It needed proof. Caitlin Clark didn't ask the sport to believe. She showed it what belief looks like in action. Nike didn't cheer loudly. They listened. And then they built. Spring 2026 isn't just a shoe release. It's a line in the sand. That's the moment women's basketball fully steps into global brand territory that used to belong almost exclusively to men's sports. Not as a side story, not as a niche market, but as a scalable business. Caitlin Clark isn't the exception. She's the proof that belief can be built, that doubt can be leveraged, that one player can shift attention, money, and power at the same time. Nike didn't predict the future with this ad. They locked it in. That kid shooting alone in the cold didn't just build range. She built a roadmap. And now the rest of the world is catching up. If you enjoy breaking down the moves brands don't want noticed, the signals hidden in plain sight, and the moments that quietly change sports forever, you'll want to stay here. Subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next, because the biggest shifts always happen before most people realize they're happening. And trust me, this isn't the last time we'll be talking about Caitlin Clark.